Most people think ordering a steak is a matter of personal preference. Rare, medium, well done. It sounds like a choice driven by taste. But that idea breaks down the moment you look at what's actually happening inside the meat. A steak does not respond to opinions. It responds to heat. Every level of doneness is simply a different stage in how temperature transforms protein, melts fat, and drives moisture out of the muscle. What you're choosing is not a preference. You're choosing a point on a spectrum of physical change. At the lower end of that spectrum sits blue rare. Cooked for barely a minute or two, the outside is exposed to intense heat, just long enough to form a thin sear, while the inside remains essentially raw and cold, often below 115 degrees Fahrenheit. The structure of the meat is almost untouched. Proteins have not tightened. Fat has not rendered, and moisture has not escaped. It is the closest you can get to eating beef in its original state, while still technically cooking it. It's not widely ordered, and many restaurants will prepare it reluctantly, but it establishes the baseline. Heat has barely begun to do its work. Move up slightly, and you reach rare, around 125 degrees Fahrenheit. Now the steak is warm in the center, still red and soft, but beginning to change. The outer crust forms through the Maillard reaction, where high surface temperatures create the complex browned flavors people associate with a proper sear. Inside, however, the muscle fibers remain relaxed, allowing the meat to retain most of its natural juices. This is why rare is often considered the minimum acceptable doneness for high-quality cuts. It is not undercooked, it is controlled. Then comes medium rare, the point where nearly every professional kitchen aims by default. At 130 to 135 degrees Fahrenheit, the internal dynamics shift in a meaningful way. Fat begins to render, distributing flavor throughout the meat, while the muscle fibers remain loose enough to preserve tenderness. The center is warm, pink, and slightly firm. This balance between structure and softness, between flavor and moisture, is what makes medium rare the standard. Not because of tradition, but because of consistency. It is where the physics of heat and meat align most effectively. From there, medium introduces more firmness. At 140 to 145 degrees Fahrenheit, the pink center shrinks and the muscle fibers tighten further. More fat has melted, particularly in well-marbled cuts, like ribeye, which can actually improve the eating experience by spreading richness more evenly. This is why medium is sometimes preferred for fattier steaks. The additional heat sacrifices a degree of tenderness, but unlocks deeper flavor. The right doneness is not universal. It depends on the structure of the cut itself. Beyond that lies medium well, typically between 150 and 155 degrees Fahrenheit. Only a trace of pink remains in the center, and the rest of the steak turns gray and firm. Moisture loss becomes more noticeable, and the texture begins to toughen. Medium well exists for those who want reassurance, very little pink, without fully committing to well done. It is a compromise, and like most compromises, it doesn't fully deliver on either side. You lose the juiciness of lower temperatures without gaining the full certainty of complete doneness. At the far end is well done, above 160 degrees Fahrenheit. All pink disappears. The muscle fibers contract completely, pushing out much of the internal moisture. What remains is a firmer, drier steak. Despite its reputation among chefs, well done continues to be widely ordered, often driven by habit or concerns about undercooked food. The tension between diners and kitchens over this choice has existed for decades. But scientifically, there is no mystery here. The more heat you apply, the more moisture you lose, and the more the texture changes. The steak is simply following the rules of thermodynamics. Doneness, however, is only part of the story. How a steak is cooked, the technique used, can change the outcome just as dramatically as temperature. Consider Pittsburgh-style steak, also known as black and blue. This method relies on extreme heat, often exceeding 700 degrees Fahrenheit, to create a deeply charred exterior while leaving the interior completely raw. The result is a stark contrast, a blackened crust wrapped around a cold center. The origins are often linked to steelworkers, who used superheated metal surfaces to cook meat quickly during breaks. Whether or not the story is entirely accurate, the method requires a level of heat that most home kitchens cannot achieve. What it produces is something visually aggressive, but intensely flavorful. Dry-aged beef approaches transformation from a completely different angle. Instead of changing the meat through cooking, it changes it over time. Large cuts are stored in controlled environments for weeks or even months, allowing enzymes to break down muscle fibers while moisture slowly evaporates. This process tenderizes the meat and concentrates its flavor. A hardened outer layer forms and must be trimmed away, reducing the overall weight and increasing cost. What remains is denser, more complex, and more intensely beefy. Aging does not add flavor. It removes everything that dilutes it. Salt crust cooking takes a more controlled approach. The steak is encased in a thick mixture of coarse salt and egg whites, forming a sealed shell when baked. This crust traps heat and moisture, creating an even cooking environment that protects the meat from direct exposure. Despite the heavy use of salt, the interior does not become overly salty because the crust acts as insulation rather than seasoning. When broken open at the table, it delivers a dramatic presentation. In this case, the experience is as important as the technique itself. Butter-basting is perhaps the most recognizable restaurant technique. After searing the steak in a hot pan, butter is added along with aromatics like garlic and herbs. The melted butter is then spooned continuously over the meat, coating it in hot fat that enhances the crust and carries flavor deeper into the surface. As the butter browns, it develops nutty, complex notes that amplify the overall taste. It appears simple, but it requires precise timing and control. Done correctly, it elevates the steak beyond what basic searing can achieve. Campfire cooking introduces a different variable entirely: unpredictability. Cooking over open flames exposes the meat to smoke, uneven heat, and direct contact with fire. In its most extreme form, the dirty steak method places the meat directly onto hot coals. No pan, no barrier, just heat and ash. The result is a rugged crust infused with smoke and char, producing flavors that cannot be replicated in controlled indoor environments. It is less precise, but often more distinctive. At the highest level of quality sits Wagyu A5, defined by its extraordinary marbling. The fat is distributed so densely throughout the muscle that the meat appears almost white. This fat melts at body temperature, meaning it begins to dissolve as soon as it touches your tongue. Because of this, Wagyu is served in small portions, not only because it is expensive, but because its richness is overwhelming in large quantities. It is not designed to be consumed like a typical steak. It is designed to be experienced. Beyond technique and quality, steak is shaped by culture. Steak Tartare, for example, is completely raw beef, finely chopped and combined with ingredients like capers, mustard, and egg yolk. It relies entirely on freshness and careful handling. When prepared correctly, it is safe. When it is not, it is not. The dish challenges assumptions about raw food and demonstrates that technique often matters more than instinct. Surf and turf, on the other hand, has little to do with culinary logic. Pairing steak with lobster or shrimp does not inherently improve either component. Its popularity comes from what it represents. In mid-century America, being able to order both meat and seafood signaled wealth. It was not about flavor. It was about abundance and choice. Steak Frites takes the opposite approach. A simple combination of steak and fries, it became popular in European bistros as an affordable, efficient meal. Its success lies in its simplicity. Protein and starch, cooked well and served without excess. It spread globally not because it was complex, but because it was effective. Across all of these variations, one pattern remains clear. Steak is not defined by a single factor. It is shaped by heat, refined by technique, elevated by quality, and interpreted through culture. What you experience on the plate is the result of all four working together. The steak does not adjust to your expectations. It does not respond to preference. It follows the laws of heat, chemistry, and time. Everything else is interpretation. At its core, the discussion around steak, doneness, technique, quality, and culture reveals a broader principle that extends far beyond food. Outcomes are not driven by preference alone, but by understanding how systems actually work. The key message here is simple but often ignored. Whether you are cooking a steak or making decisions in life, what you get is a direct result of how well you understand the underlying mechanics. Heat changes meat in predictable ways, just as effort, time, and environment shape results in any domain. My personal perspective is that many people approach decisions based on habit, comfort, or assumptions rather than knowledge. Ordering a well-done steak because it feels safer, or choosing medium well as a compromise, reflects a deeper pattern, avoiding discomfort instead of understanding reality. The same behavior appears in daily life. People choose familiar paths not because they are optimal, but because they feel less risky. However, without understanding the system, those choices often lead to suboptimal outcomes. The practical takeaway is not that everyone should order steak a certain way, but that informed decisions consistently outperform instinctive ones. In real life, this means taking time to understand cause and effect before acting. If you want better results, whether in health, career, or relationships, you need to identify the variables that actually matter. Just as temperature determines texture and flavor in steak, your inputs determine your outcomes. This requires a shift from passive consumption to active awareness. Instead of asking, "What do I prefer?" a more useful question becomes, "How does this actually work?" That mindset alone changes the quality of decisions dramatically. Another important insight is that technique often matters as much as intention. Two people can start with the same resources but achieve completely different results, depending on how they apply them. In cooking, butter-basting, or proper heat control, can transform a basic steak into something exceptional. In life, the equivalent is skill. How you execute matters more than what you start with. This suggests a clear strategy. Invest in learning the right methods, not just pursuing outcomes. Practice, repetition, and refinement, like mastering a cooking technique, create consistency over time. Finally, the cultural aspect highlights that not everything is about logic or optimization. Some choices are symbolic. People order surf and turf not because it makes culinary sense, but because it represents status. This reflects a broader truth. Human behavior is not always rational, and understanding that helps you navigate social environments more effectively. The solution is balance. Know when to optimize for results, and when to recognize the role of perception, identity, and experience. In the end, the deeper meaning is this: life, like cooking, follows principles whether you acknowledge them or not. You can rely on preference and hope for good outcomes, or you can understand the system and make deliberate choices. The difference between the two is not subtle. It is the difference between randomness and control.